The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like a scream trapped inside metal, and it woke me before my own eyes could open. I was thrown against the wall of my sleeping pod, and for one heartbeat I believed I was still dreaming. Then the second impact came, harder than the first, and I understood this was real. My name is Maren Voss, and I was 26 years old the night the ship called Solus lost its way between the stars. We had been traveling for 9 years by then, carrying 4,000 people toward a world called Illyra Prime, a place none of us had seen, except in pictures sent back by unmanned probes decades earlier. Green oceans, twin moons, air we could breathe without a mask. It was supposed to take 40 years in total. We were not even a quarter of the way there. I ran into the corridor in my sleeping clothes, bare feet slapping against cold metal, and I was not alone. Dozens of people spilled out of their quarters at the same moment, faces pale, eyes wide, all of us asking the same question with our silence. What is happening? The ship's voice, calm and steady as always, cut through the noise. Attention! Hull breach detected in sections 11 through 14. Emergency doors sealing now. All personnel report to designated safety zones immediately. I remember thinking, foolishly, that this must be a drill. We had drills every month. Fire drills, breach drills, drills for engine failure and drills for medical outbreaks. But drills did not throw you against a wall. Drills did not make the floor tilt beneath your feet like the whole vessel was trying to shake us off like water from a dog's back. Then the lights failed. Darkness swallowed the corridor whole, and in that darkness I heard something worse than screaming. I heard silence. 4,000 people, and for 3 full seconds nobody made a sound. Then the emergency lighting flickered on, dim and red, and the screaming started again, and somehow that was almost a relief, because at least it meant we were all still alive to make noise. I found my footing and pressed myself against the wall, letting the crowd move past me while I tried to think. My father had been an engineer on this ship since before I was born. If anyone would know what was happening, it would be him. I pushed against the current of frightened bodies, moving toward the lower decks where the engine crews worked, and every step felt like walking through a nightmare made of metal and fear. I found him in the central control room, along with a dozen other engineers, all of them staring at screens that flashed too many colors at once, red and orange and a sickly yellow that I had never seen the system display before. "Dad," I said, though my voice came out smaller than I intended. He turned, and for just a moment his face softened at the sight of me, the way it always did, before the fear came rushing back into his eyes. "Maren, you should not be down here." "I need to know what is happening," I said. Before he could answer, a woman at the far console spoke without turning around. Her name was Iris Bellamy, the lead systems engineer, and I had known her my whole life as a steady, unshakable presence. That night her voice trembled. "We hit something," she said. "Not an asteroid, not debris. The scanners never saw it coming. It tore through the outer hull like it was paper, and it knocked us completely off our navigational path." "Off course by how much?" my father asked. Iris looked up from her screen, and the look on her face told me the answer before her mouth ever moved. "We do not know," she said. "The navigation array is damaged. We are drifting, and until we can repair it, we do not know where we are going or how to get back to where we were." The room went quiet, except for the low hum of failing systems and the distant sound of emergency crews shouting orders through the corridors above us. I remember staring at the star charts on the main screen, watching our little glowing dot sit motionless against a black canvas scattered with light, and thinking that we had never looked so small. Over the following hours, the true scope of the disaster became clear. Whatever had struck us had damaged not just our navigation, but our main propulsion core. We could still generate power, we could still keep the lights on and the air breathable, but the great engines that were meant to carry us across the black distance to Illyra Prime were silent, and repairing them would take time we did not know if we had. Worse than that, the impact had knocked us out of the safe corridor of space our engineers had charted before launch, a route free of major gravitational hazards and debris fields. Now we were drifting through unmapped space, blind, with no way to call for help that could arrive in less than several human lifetimes. Captain Aldrich Kane called every remaining department head to the main hall by morning, though morning and night meant nothing out here except by the ship's own clock. I stood near the back with my father, watching the captain's face as he studied the reports handed to him one by one. He was a broad-shouldered man who rarely allowed his expression to slip, but that night I saw his jaw tighten more than once. "Give me the truth," he finally said. "All of it, however bad." Iris stepped forward. "The truth, Captain, is that we no longer know our way home, and we no longer have the engines to reach our destination even if we did know the way. Our life support can keep us alive for a long time if we ration carefully. But we are, for the moment, lost." Nobody spoke. I felt my father's hand find my shoulder and grip it tightly. The captain closed his eyes for a moment, just a moment, and when he opened them again, something in his posture had changed. He straightened his back. He looked out at the department heads gathered before him, farmers and doctors and teachers and engineers, ordinary people who had trusted this ship with their entire lives. "Then we survive," he said simply. "However long it takes, we survive." I did not understand, in that moment, what those two words would come to mean. I did not know that survive would become the only word that mattered, the only goal that could unite 4,000 frightened people, scattered across a dying machine drifting through nothing. I only knew that my hands were shaking, and that somewhere above us, the stars we had once been traveling toward no longer knew we existed. That first day, nobody slept. We moved supplies, sealed broken sections, counted the injured, and counted, quietly and without saying it aloud, the missing. 11 people had been in the sections that lost pressure when the hull was struck. 11 people who had gone to sleep the night before with dreams of green oceans and twin moons, and who would never open their eyes again. I did not know any of them personally, but I remember standing outside the sealed doors of Section 12 with a woman named Petra Lindgren, who had lost her husband in that section, and holding her hand while she cried, because there was nothing else I could offer her. No words could fix what had happened. No promise could bring him back. All I could do was stay and let her know she was not alone in her grief. That, I think, was the moment I began to understand something about survival that the engineers and their calculations could never capture. Survival was not only about oxygen levels and food supplies and the structural integrity of a hull. It was about whether people could still find the strength to hold each other up when everything around them was falling apart. By the end of that first terrible day, Captain Kane gathered the entire ship together, as many as could fit into the main hall, with the rest listening through speakers in every corridor and quarter. He did not offer false comfort. He did not pretend the danger had passed. "We do not know how long we will be out here," he said, his voice carrying steady and clear through every speaker on the ship. "We do not know when, or if, rescue will find us. What I do know is this. We built this ship to carry a colony to a new world. We have the knowledge, the skill, and the will to build a life anywhere, even here, even now, drifting in the dark. We are not simply passengers anymore. We are the colony, and a colony does not wait to be saved. A colony builds." I stood in that crowded hall, pressed between strangers and friends, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Fear was still there. It would always be there, in some form, for years to come. But beneath the fear, something else began to grow, small and stubborn, like a seed pushed into cold soil. We had lost our course, we had lost our engines, and we had lost 11 lives that could never be replaced. But as I looked around that hall, at the tired, frightened, determined faces of everyone who remained, I understood that Solace had not lost its people. And as long as that remained true, I began to believe we had not truly lost anything that could not, somehow, be found again. None of us could have known, that first terrible night, just how long the darkness ahead would stretch, or what kind of people we would have to become in order to survive it. I only knew that when the captain finished speaking, and the hall fell into a heavy, exhausted silence, my father squeezed my shoulder once more and said the words that I would carry with me through everything that followed. "We are still here, Marin. That is where it begins. I did not know then how true those words would prove to be, or how many more nights like this one waited for us in the black distance ahead. I only knew that the question every person on that ship was silently asking themselves had already found its first answer. We were not finished, not yet, not for a long, long time. The days that followed blurred into a single long stretch of exhausting labor. Every able body on the ship was assigned a task, whether it was repairing damaged systems, redistributing supplies, or comforting the grieving. I was given work in the agricultural bay, tending to the hydroponic gardens that would need to feed us for however long our journey through the unknown might last. It was not glamorous work, but it felt important in a way I had never appreciated before the disaster. Every seed I planted was a small act of defiance against the darkness outside our hull. Iris and her engineering teams worked around the clock, trying to restore even partial function to our navigation systems, while other crews searched for a way to repair the propulsion core using whatever materials remained undamaged. Progress was slow, and every small victory came paired with a new problem nobody had anticipated. But slowly, painfully, the ship began to stabilize. The immediate crisis passed, even as a much longer, quieter crisis settled over all of us like a fog that refused to lift. We were alive. We had food, water, and air, at least for now, but we were also completely alone, farther from any known world than any group of humans had ever traveled before, with no certainty of ever finding our way back to the path we had lost. The question that had once seemed abstract and distant, printed only in mission briefings and scientific papers, had become the only question that truly mattered to every person aboard. How long could a colony ship survive in deep space, when everything it depended on had been taken away? I did not have an answer that first week. None of us did, but I remember standing in the observation deck late one night, staring out at a field of unfamiliar stars that belonged to no chart we possessed, and feeling, for the first time since the disaster, something other than fear. I felt curiosity. I felt the smallest flicker of hope, and somewhere deep inside myself, though I could not have explained it then, I felt certain that whatever answer we found to that terrible question, it would not be the one anyone watching from outside might expect. 3 months after the collision, the word rationing stopped being something we read about in old history lessons and became the shape of our everyday lives. Captain Kane called it careful living. Iris Bellamy, who never bothered softening hard truths, called it survival math. Whatever name we gave it, the meaning was the same. Every drop of water, every calorie of food, every unit of power pulled from our failing reactors had to be measured, tracked, and justified. I was moved from the agricultural bay to a new role helping coordinate resource distribution between sections, working under a soft-spoken woman named Odalise Frayne, who had once been a simple supply clerk before the disaster, and now found herself responsible for deciding how much food each family received each week. I watched her carry that burden every single day, watched the way her hands trembled slightly whenever she signed off on another reduction to the ration lists, and I understood that some kinds of courage do not look like bravery at all. Sometimes courage looks like a tired woman doing an impossible job because somebody has to. The ship itself seemed to be dying by inches. Sections that could not be repaired were sealed permanently, their air vented back into the main reserves, their space abandoned to darkness and silence. I remember walking past the sealed doors of what used to be the recreation center, a place where children once played games and old couples once danced on quiet evenings, and feeling a strange grief for a room I would never enter again. It was such a small loss compared to the lives we had already lost, and yet it stayed with me, a reminder that solace itself was shrinking around us, folding inward like a wounded animal trying to protect what little warmth remained inside it. Power was the hardest problem of all. Our main reactor had survived the collision, but at reduced output, and every system on the ship competed for what little energy remained. Captain Kane and the Engineering Council made the decision, difficult but necessary, to consolidate the population into the ship's central sections, closer to the reactor core, where heating and life support could be maintained more efficiently. Families who had lived in the outer rings for 9 years were asked to leave their homes behind and move into shared quarters closer to the heart of the vessel. I helped my own family pack what little we could carry, and I watched my father stand for a long moment in the doorway of the small apartment where I had grown up, his eyes moving slowly across the room as though trying to memorize every detail before it disappeared behind a sealed door forever. He did not say anything. He simply nodded once, picked up his bag, and walked forward without looking back. I understood, even then, that this was how he intended to survive whatever came next, not by dwelling on what was lost, but by refusing to stop moving forward. The ship's central computer, which most of us simply called Solus, the same name as the vessel itself, took on a new importance during those months. It had always managed basic systems, environmental controls, communications, and scheduling, but now it became something closer to a steady, patient voice, guiding us through decisions too complicated for any single person to make alone. Solus calculated exactly how long our remaining food supplies could last under different rationing scenarios. It modeled which systems could be safely shut down without risking catastrophic failure elsewhere. It even helped mediate disputes between department heads who disagreed, sometimes bitterly, about how limited resources should be divided. I do not think any of us fully appreciated, in those early months, just how much we had come to depend on that calm, unwavering voice. It never panicked. It never grew impatient, even when frightened, grieving people shouted at consoles as though the machine itself were responsible for our misfortune. It simply continued, day after day, offering the clearest path forward that it could calculate, leaving the harder choices, the truly human choices, to us. One evening, several months into our drift, Captain Kane called a meeting of every department head, myself included, since Odalise had asked me to represent our supply division in her place, while she rested after days without proper sleep. We gathered in what remained of the main hall, smaller now, quieter, filled with faces that had grown thinner and more tired since the night of the collision. Iris presented the numbers first, as she always did, laying out projections for our remaining reserves of food, water, fuel, and breathable air. The figures were not encouraging. Even with strict rationing, even with every possible efficiency the engineering teams could squeeze from our failing systems, we had perhaps 8 years before critical shortages began to threaten the population in earnest. 8 years, drifting through unmapped space, with no engines to carry us toward rescue and no certainty that rescue existed at all. A murmur passed through the room, and I felt my own stomach tighten at the number. 8 years sounded like a very long time, and also like no time at all, depending on which direction I let my thoughts wander. Captain Kane let the silence stretch for a moment before he spoke. 8 years is not a sentence, he said. It is a deadline, and deadlines can move if we are clever enough and determined enough to move them. He turned to a young man near the front of the room, an agricultural specialist named Corin Ashby, who had been quietly experimenting with new growing techniques in the hydroponic bays since the disaster. Corin, tell them what you told me yesterday. Corin stood, visibly nervous at being addressed in front of so many senior officials, but his voice steadied as he began to explain. He had discovered a way to modify our existing growing systems to produce nearly double the caloric yield using the same amount of water and power, by adjusting light cycles and introducing new crop rotations better suited to our reduced resources. It was not a perfect solution, but it was something, a way of stretching 8 years into something longer, something that might give us more time to solve the larger problems facing the ship. That was the moment I began to truly understand the nature of the fight ahead of us. It would not be won through a single dramatic breakthrough, some brilliant invention that solved everything at once. It would be won, if it was won at all, through 1,000 small victories like Corin's discovery, each one buying us a little more time, each one built on the desperate ingenuity of ordinary people refusing to accept that our story had already ended. Over the following year, those small victories accumulated. A team of former mechanics found a way to repurpose damaged shuttle engines into auxiliary power generators, adding precious extra capacity to our failing grid. A group of teachers and historians, led by a thoughtful, patient man named Bram Halloway, began the difficult work of deciding what knowledge absolutely had to be preserved and passed on, in case the worst happened and future generations grew up without ever seeing the world their ancestors had come from. Medical staff developed new treatments using whatever materials remained available, stretching supplies that should have run out years before their eventual replacement. I found myself drawn increasingly to Bram's work, spending my limited free hours helping him and his small team catalog everything they believed mattered most, from practical knowledge like engineering principles and medical treatments to something harder to quantify, the stories, songs, and traditions that had defined human life for thousands of years before any of us had ever left the ground of our homeworld behind. Bram believed, fiercely, that survival meant nothing if we allowed ourselves to forget who we were in the process of simply staying alive. "We are not just trying to keep hearts beating," he told me one evening, as we sat together in the small library that had been relocated to the central sections during the consolidation. "We are trying to keep something worth beating for. If we save everybody on this ship, but let go of everything that made us human in the first place, what exactly will we have preserved?" I did not have an answer for him that night, but his words stayed with me, returning again and again in the months that followed, whenever exhaustion or grief threatened to convince me that survival alone was enough. Not everyone shared Bram's patience, of course. Resources remained desperately scarce, and scarcity has a way of revealing the sharpest edges in people who might otherwise have remained gentle. I witnessed arguments over ration portions that nearly turned violent, watched neighbors who had once shared meals together grow suspicious of one another over suspected hoarding, saw the particular kind of fear that scarcity breeds slowly eroding the trust that had once held our small community together. Captain Kane worked tirelessly to hold that trust in place, walking the corridors himself many evenings, speaking with families, listening to complaints, making himself visible and accountable in a way that I think prevented at least some of the worse outcomes that fear and desperation might otherwise have produced. I do not believe he slept more than a few hours most nights during those first difficult years. I remember seeing him once, very late, sitting alone in the observation deck, staring out at the unfamiliar stars with an expression I had never seen on his face before, something between exhaustion and a kind of quiet, stubborn resolve. I did not disturb him that night. I simply stood at the entrance for a moment, watching the captain of our lost, drifting colony ship carry the weight of 4,000 lives on shoulders that were, after all, no stronger or more capable than any other human beings. Then I left him to his silence, understanding somehow that even leaders needed a private moment to simply exist as tired, frightened people, before returning to the enormous responsibility waiting for them each morning. What none of us knew, during those early years of rationing and quiet desperation, was that we were not, in fact, entirely alone. Far beyond the edge of our sensor range, in the deep black spaces between what little light reached us from distant, unfamiliar stars, something had noticed our small, wounded vessel drifting through territory that had never before recorded the presence of human technology. It did not approach. It did not announce itself in any way we could have detected with our damaged instruments. It simply watched, patient and distant, recording our slow, stubborn struggle to survive, forming judgments about the strange, fragile creatures aboard the crippled ship that continued, against every reasonable expectation, to fight for another day, and then another after that. I would not learn of this silent observation for a very long time. None of us would. We continued our work, our rationing, our careful, desperate preservation of both bodies and stories, entirely unaware that we were, in a sense, being tested by watchers we could not see, who were beginning to ask themselves the very same question that had consumed our own thoughts since the night of the collision. How long could a colony ship survive in deep space? And more importantly, what kind of people would they become in the process of finding out? 18 years passed, and the strangest part was how ordinary they came to feel. There is a particular kind of adjustment that happens to people who live long enough inside an emergency. The emergency stops feeling like an emergency at all. It simply becomes life, with its own rhythms, its own small joys, its own quiet griefs folded so deeply into daily routine that most days you almost forget to notice them. I was 44 years old when my niece Rin, my brother's daughter, asked me a question that stopped me completely still in the middle of the central corridor. "Aunt Marin," she said, her voice full of the easy curiosity that only children seem to possess, "is it true that people used to walk outside without a suit on? Just breathe the air right there, without anything covering their face?" Rin had been born 9 years after the collision. She had never known any home other than solace. She had never felt wind on her skin, never seen a horizon that was not curved metal or a viewing window. To her, and to the dozens of children born in those years who shared her experience, stories of open sky and wild rain were closer to folklore than memory, closer to the kinds of things ancient civilizations once believed about gods living on mountaintops. "Yes," I told her, kneeling down so we were closer to eye level. "That is true. Your grandfather used to tell me about running through fields as a boy, before I was even born. Grass under his feet. Real sunlight, not the growing lamps we use now." Rin considered this with the serious concentration children bring to strange new ideas. "Do you think we will ever get to do that?" she asked. "Walk outside, I mean, on a real world." I did not have an honest answer that would not frighten her, so I gave her the answer Captain Kane had taught all of us to give, the answer that had somehow become woven into the fabric of how we spoke to the youngest generation about our uncertain future. "I believe we will find our way there eventually," I told her, "and when we do, you will be the one explaining to your own children what it felt like the very first time." She smiled at that, satisfied, and ran off toward the education hall where Bram Halloway's carefully preserved lessons continued to be taught to a generation that had never seen the world those lessons described. That conversation stayed with me for weeks afterward, because it crystallized something I had been feeling for a long time without quite naming it. We were no longer simply survivors waiting for rescue. We had become something else entirely, a people whose entire understanding of reality had been shaped inside the hull of a wounded ship. The children born after the collision knew no other sky than the black expanse visible through our observation windows. They knew no other ground than metal decking. Some of the youngest among them had begun to speak of Earth and Alira Prime not as real places their parents remembered, but as something closer to legend, distant and half-believed, the way ancient sailors once spoke of lands beyond the edge of the known map. I worried, during those years, that we were slowly losing something essential, some connection to the truth of who we were and where we had come from, simply because the youngest generation had no direct experience to anchor those stories in reality. I brought this concern to Bram one evening, as we sat together reviewing the education materials his team continued to refine and expand. "You are not wrong to worry," he told me, setting aside the tablet in his hands. "But I think you are looking at only half the problem. Yes, they may come to see Earth as legend. But legends are not weak things, Marin. Legends are how humans have always carried their most important truths across generations, too vast for simple memory to survive. If our children grow up believing in Earth and Alira Prime the way ancient people believed in their sacred stories, that belief may prove stronger, not weaker, than plain memory ever could." I did not fully agree with him that night, but I came to understand his point more fully as the years continued to pass. The stories did not weaken. If anything, they grew more vivid, more cherished, retold and embellished by each new generation of children, eager to imagine a world beyond the only one they had ever known. Solace itself became something of a living mythology, its damaged sections and sealed corridors taking on their own quiet legends. Tales whispered among children about the ghosts of the recreation center, about brave engineers who had once given their lives to save the ship during the first terrible night none of them remembered. Leadership, too, began to shift during those years. Captain Kane, worn thin by nearly 2 decades of relentless responsibility, finally stepped back from daily command, passing authority to a council of younger officers who had grown up under his guidance. Iris Bellamy's own daughter, a sharp-minded young woman named Tessa, took over much of the engineering division, having spent her entire childhood learning the ship's failing systems as intimately as any person alive. I remained in resource coordination, working now alongside Odalus Frayne's own successor, but I found myself drawn increasingly toward Bram's work of preservation, until eventually I became something like a keeper of memory myself, responsible for maintaining the historical records, interviewing the aging original crew members before their stories were lost forever, and ensuring that the truth, however strange it had become, remained available for anyone who wished to seek it out beneath the growing layer of legend. It was during this period that the ship faced perhaps its most severe crisis since the original collision. Tessa Bellamy came to the Council one difficult morning with news that the auxiliary reactor systems, the very generators her mother's team had built from salvaged shuttle engines nearly 15 years earlier, had begun failing beyond any possible repair. Our power reserves, already stretched thin by nearly 2 decades of careful rationing, would drop to dangerously low levels within a matter of months, unless drastic action was taken. The Council debated for days, examining every possible option, however painful. In the end, the decision came down to something none of us had ever wanted to consider. An entire residential section, home to nearly 300 people, would need to be sealed off and its power redirected entirely to the ship's core systems, forcing its residents to relocate into already crowded central quarters that could barely accommodate the increased population. I sat in that council meeting as the vote was taken, watching faces I had known my entire life wrestle with a decision that would upend hundreds of lives in order to preserve the lives of thousands more. Captain Kane, though no longer in formal command, was invited to speak before the final vote, and his words that day remained with me for the rest of my life. "We have never pretended this journey would be painless," he said, his voice older now, roughened by years of strain, but still carrying the same steady authority it always had. "Every choice we have made since the night we lost our course has cost us something. Tonight will be no different. But I have watched this ship and these people prove again and again that we are capable of enduring what should, by every reasonable measure, be unendurable. We will grieve what this decision costs us. And then, as we always have, we will continue." The vote passed. The relocation happened over the following weeks, difficult and sorrowful, families packing away the only homes many of the youngest among them had ever known, moving into shared spaces that tested everyone's patience and generosity. I helped where I could, listening to frightened children and exhausted parents, doing my small part to ease a transition that could never be made entirely painless. It was during those chaotic weeks of relocation that Solace, the ship's ever-present computer voice, delivered a message that changed everything we thought we understood about our situation. "Attention! Long-range sensors have detected an unidentified signal, originating from an unknown source approximately 3 light-years from our current position. Signal pattern does not match any known natural phenomenon. Recommend immediate review by Command Council." I remember exactly where I was standing when that announcement echoed through every corridor of the ship, in the newly crowded central hall, helping an elderly woman named Petra Lindgren, the same woman I had comforted on the very first terrible night so many years before, carry her few remaining belongings into her new, smaller quarters. She froze at the sound of the announcement, her hand still gripping a small box of photographs that were among the only physical mementos she had managed to preserve from her old life. "After all these years," she whispered, her voice trembling with an emotion I could not quite name, "do you think it is finally happening? Do you think someone has found us?" I did not know how to answer her. I only knew that for the first time since the night the collision tore Solace from its planned course, the possibility of something beyond mere survival, something that might carry us toward an actual future rather than simply an extended present, had entered our lives once more. None of us slept well that night, myself included. I lay awake in the small shared quarters my family now occupied, staring at the metal ceiling above me, wondering what kind of answer might be waiting for us out there in the dark, and wondering, too, whether whatever had sent that signal understood anything at all about the stubborn, grieving, Endlessly resourceful people who had spent 18 years proving that a wounded colony ship could survive far longer and become far more than anyone watching from the outside might have ever expected. 3 weeks after Solace first detected that strange, distant signal, a vessel unlike anything in our archives appeared at the very edge of our sensor range. It did not approach quickly, and it did not attempt to hide its presence. It simply drifted closer, day by day, with a patience that felt almost deliberate, as though whoever piloted it wanted us to have time to prepare ourselves for whatever came next. The council debated endlessly about how to respond. Some argued for caution, for silence, fearing that revealing our position and our weakened condition to an unknown power might invite danger rather than rescue. Others, including Petra Lindgren, who had waited 18 years for exactly this kind of possibility, argued passionately that we could not afford to let fear cost us what might be our only chance at finding a way home. In the end, it was Tessa Bellamy, now leading much of our technical operations, who found a way to open careful, limited communication using an old universal signaling protocol her mother had once studied during her original training decades earlier on Earth, a system designed for exactly this kind of first contact scenario, though none of us had ever expected to actually use it. The reply came faster than any of us anticipated, translated slowly and imperfectly through systems never designed for a language so different from our own. The message was brief. We have observed your vessel for a significant span of your time. We wish to understand what we have witnessed. May we speak with those who lead you. I was present in the communication chamber, along with several members of the council, when that first true exchange took place. The being who appeared on our screen, rendered through a translation system that struggled visibly with unfamiliar biology, belonged to a species we would come to know as the Ilvain, tall and slender, with skin that shifted color slightly depending on what I later learned were subtle emotional states difficult for us to fully interpret. The Ilvain representative identified themselves through a designation that translated roughly to Observer Thessaly, and their manner, even through the imperfect translation, carried an unmistakable air of careful, scientific curiosity, the kind of curiosity a researcher might show toward a specimen behaving in ways their models had failed entirely to predict. "You have survived here for a considerable duration," Observer Thessaly said, once introductions and cautious pleasantries had been exchanged. "This surprises us. Our own recorded history includes several instances of vessels stranded under circumstances similar to yours. In every previous instance we have observed, populations declined rapidly, often collapsing entirely within a fraction of the time your people have endured." Captain Kane, who had returned to a ceremonial leadership role for this historic occasion, exchanged a glance with the younger council members before responding. "What happened to those other populations?" he asked. "The ones who did not survive as long as we have." Observer Thessaly's skin shifted through several shades before answering, a pattern I would later learn corresponded to something like discomfort. In most cases, resources failed, and cooperation failed alongside them. Populations fractured into conflict over what remained. In several instances, our own people made the difficult decision to withdraw rather than witness the outcome directly. It is, among many species we have observed across this region of space, considered a mercy to allow a doomed population to face its end without additional intrusion. A heavy silence settled over the communication chamber at those words. I understood, in that moment, that Observer Thessaly and their people had approached our small drifting ship not with the assumption that they might find survivors worth saving, but with the far more cautious expectation that they might find only the slow, sad evidence of a collapse long since completed. They had not expected to find a functioning society. They had certainly not expected to find one that had grown, however painfully, stronger, and more organized over nearly 2 decades of continuous crisis. Tessa Bellamy stepped forward then, her voice carrying the same directness her mother Iris had always been known for. "With respect, Observer," she said, "we did not simply avoid collapse by luck. We chose every single day since the disaster that stranded us here to keep choosing each other over abandoning one another to fear. That is not something that happens by accident. It is something 4,000 people built. deliberately, one difficult decision at a time. Observer Thessaly studied her for a long moment through the imperfect translation feed, their expression, or whatever passed for expression among their kind, difficult to fully read. This concept, they finally said, this deliberate choosing, despite overwhelming pressure toward fragmentation, is not well represented in our previous observations of stranded populations. We would very much like to understand it more fully, if you are willing to share your experience with us. Over the following weeks, as the Ilvain vessel drew gradually closer and eventually established a stable position alongside our own damaged ship, that careful curiosity deepened into something closer to genuine fascination. Observer Thessaly, along with a small team of their colleagues, began an extended period of careful study, not the cold clinical examination I had half feared when their vessel first appeared, but something closer to respectful conversation, an attempt to understand rather than simply to catalog. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, becoming one of the primary points of contact for these conversations, given my years of work preserving the ship's history and collecting the stories of our aging original crew members. Observer Thessaly requested, quite specifically, to speak with someone who understood not merely the technical details of our survival, but the human experience underlying it, and Bram Halloway, ever generous with sharing responsibility, recommended me for the role. I remember our first extended conversation vividly, sitting across from Observer Thessaly in a small, quiet chamber set aside for these discussions, watching their skin shift through unfamiliar patterns as they listened to me describe the night of the collision, the years of careful rationing, the relocation of entire residential sections, the children born who had never known any world beyond the metal walls surrounding them. I do not fully understand, Observer Thessaly admitted at one point, why your people did not simply divide into smaller, more easily sustained groups when resources grew scarce. Our own historical records suggest that fragmentation, while painful, often allows a larger percentage of a stranded population to survive longer than attempts to maintain unity across an entire group facing insufficient resources. I considered the question carefully before answering, aware that whatever I said would likely shape how an entire alien civilization came to understand not just our particular story, but perhaps humanity as a whole. That may be true, mathematically, I finally said, but you are asking the wrong question, I think. You are asking how many bodies could be kept breathing longest. We were never only asking that question. We were asking what kind of people we wanted to remain, throughout however long our survival lasted. Fragmenting into smaller groups might have extended a few individual lives. But it would have cost us something we valued even more than simple survival. It would have cost us each other. Observer Thessaly remained silent for a long moment, their skin settling into a pattern I had come to associate with deep consideration. This is the concept that continues to elude full translation, they finally said. Your language contains a distinction we struggle to represent adequately. Survival, as a state of continued biological function, versus something else entirely, something closer to persistence of identity, of purpose, of connection between individuals, even at potential cost to strict biological efficiency. Perhaps, I said, offering the closest thing to a smile I could manage after so many years of careful, guarded caution around unfamiliar power. Perhaps that is simply what it means to be human. We do not measure how long we survive only by counting years or calculating resources. We measure it by what remains worth surviving for. That conversation, among many others like it over the following months, seemed to shift something fundamental in how the Ilvain delegation approached their continued study of Solus and its people. Observer Thessaly began spending increasing time not merely interviewing council members and historians like myself, but simply observing daily life throughout the ship, watching children attend lessons in Bram's education hall, watching families share carefully rationed meals together in communal dining areas, watching Corin Ashby's now-grown children continue refining the agricultural techniques that had helped stretch our dwindling resources across nearly 2 decades of continuous crisis. I do not think Observer Thessaly, or any of their colleagues, had ever expected to find genuine warmth, genuine humor, genuine art and music, and quiet daily joy, existing alongside such prolonged and severe hardship. I remember overhearing a conversation between Observer Thessaly and one of their junior colleagues, not intended for human ears but caught nonetheless through an imperfectly muted translation channel, in which the junior observer expressed something close to astonishment that a population enduring such conditions could still produce laughter, still compose songs, still find reasons to celebrate small victories alongside their much larger, ongoing struggle. This does not match our previous models of stranded population psychology, the junior observer said. By every measure we have previously recorded, prolonged severe scarcity should have produced significant psychological deterioration by this stage. Instead, we observe what appears to be genuine communal resilience, even flourishing, under conditions our own species would likely have found unsustainable. Observer Thessaly's response, quiet and thoughtful, stayed with me long afterward. Perhaps our previous models were built upon populations who believed survival itself was the only worthwhile goal, they said. This population appears to believe something different. They appear to believe that how they survive matters as much as whether they survive at all. That may be the variable our models have consistently failed to account for. As the months of careful study continued, a new and more urgent question began to emerge within the Ilvain delegation, one that Observer Thessaly eventually brought before our full council with evident hesitation. We did not initially approach your vessel with the intention of offering direct assistance, they explained, their skin cycling through a pattern I had come to recognize as something like careful diplomatic caution. Our observation protocols generally favor recording stranded populations without significant intervention, to avoid disrupting natural outcomes that might provide valuable data for understanding similar situations elsewhere. However, what we have witnessed here has caused significant debate within our own governing structures. There is growing support, among those who have reviewed our reports, for offering your people direct assistance in repairing your vessel and continuing your journey toward your intended destination. The council chamber fell into stunned silence at those words. I looked around at faces I had known my entire life. Captain Kane, now visibly moved, despite his usual careful composure, Tessa Bellamy gripping the edge of the table before her, Bram Halloway's eyes bright with an emotion too complex to easily name. 18 years of careful, exhausting survival, and here, finally, was the possibility of something more than mere continuation. The possibility of an actual future, an actual arrival, an actual end to the long, uncertain drift that had defined nearly 2 decades of our collective lives. But Captain Kane, ever cautious, ever thoughtful, did not immediately accept the offer without question. What would such assistance require of us? He asked carefully. We have learned, through hard experience, that nothing in this universe comes without some form of cost. Observer Thessaly's response was, I think, the moment that truly cemented whatever relationship would eventually form between our two peoples. Your caution is reasonable and reflects exactly the kind of careful judgment that has allowed your survival thus far, they said. We ask nothing beyond continued permission to study what we have witnessed here, and perhaps, if your people are willing, the opportunity to share what we have learned with other populations we may encounter in similarly difficult circumstances in the future. What your people have demonstrated here may prove valuable knowledge, not merely for our own understanding, but for any future population facing the same terrible question your own journey has already answered. I remember Captain Kane's long pause before responding, his eyes moving slowly across the gathered council, across faces that had aged nearly 2 decades since the night of the original collision, faces marked by grief and exhaustion, but also, unmistakably, by a hard-won resilience that no amount of hardship had managed to fully extinguish. Then let us show you, he finally said, everything that question required us to become. The repairs began within days, though nothing about the process turned out to be as simple as any of us had hoped. The Ilvain possessed technology far more advanced than our own damaged systems, but Tessa Bellamy insisted, and Captain Kane firmly agreed, that our own engineers would work alongside their counterparts every step of the way, rather than simply stepping aside and allowing an unfamiliar power to rebuild our ship without our full understanding and participation. I did not fully appreciate, at first, just how dangerous that final stretch of repairs would prove to be. Our propulsion core, damaged nearly 2 decades earlier and never fully repaired, had grown increasingly unstable over the years, despite our engineers' best efforts to maintain it at minimal, careful output. Restoring it to full function, a necessary step if we hoped to finally resume our journey toward a Lyra Prime, meant reactivating systems that had lain dormant and untested for 18 years, with no absolute guarantee that the aging structure could safely handle the sudden increase in power flowing through it once again. Tessa Bellamy led the combined repair team herself, working alongside a senior Ilvain engineer named Korvath, whose careful, methodical approach to the unfamiliar human technology impressed even our own most experienced engineers. I spent those final weeks moving between my usual work and the observation deck nearest the engineering section, unable to fully concentrate on anything else while the fate of our entire future hung in the balance. The critical moment came on what should have been an unremarkable evening, nearly 3 months after the Ilvain vessel first made contact. I was in the central hall, helping Bram Halloway organize records for what we all hoped would soon become a joyful, historic transition, when the ship's alarms sounded once more, sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet hum of ordinary daily life, exactly as they had on that very first terrible night so many years before. Attention! Reactor core stability critical. All non-essential personnel evacuate to designated safe zones immediately. For one horrible moment, I felt 18 years collapse into a single instant, and I was 26 years old again, thrown against the wall of my sleeping pod, uncertain whether I would survive the night. I forced myself to breathe, to remember that I was no longer that frightened young woman alone in the dark, but someone who had spent nearly 2 decades learning exactly what it meant to hold steady when everything threatened to fall apart. I ran toward the engineering section instead of away from it, against every instruction blaring through the corridor speakers, because I needed to know, needed to see for myself, whether this new crisis would undo everything we had survived to reach this moment. I found Captain Kane already there, standing at the edge of the sealed observation window overlooking the reactor chamber, his face illuminated by the harsh red emergency lighting that had returned, cruelly familiar, after so many years. "What is happening?" I asked, breathless from running. "The reintegration process destabilized faster than projected," he said, his voice tight with controlled tension. "Tessa and Korvath are still inside, trying to manually stabilize the core before it reaches critical failure." Through the reinforced window, I could see them, 2 figures working desperately at the reactor controls, one human and one Ilvain, moving with a coordinated urgency that transcended whatever differences existed between our 2 species. Alarms continued blaring around them, warning lights flashing in increasingly rapid rhythm that even I, with my limited technical knowledge, understood meant time was running dangerously short. I do not know how long I stood there, watching, unable to help in any practical way, feeling once again the same helpless fear I had felt on the very first night of our disaster, when 11 lives had been lost to circumstances entirely beyond anyone's control. I thought of Ren, now a grown woman herself, expecting her own first child within the year. I thought of Petra Lindgren, who had waited so long, hoped so desperately, for exactly this chance at finally reaching an actual destination after decades of uncertain drift. I thought of everyone who had trusted this ship, and each other, and the fragile, stubborn hope that had carried us this far, and I found myself praying, in whatever way I still remembered how, that 18 years of survival would not end in failure now, so close to whatever future waited beyond this final crisis. Then, through the chaos and the alarms and the flashing warning lights, I saw Tessa Bellamy's hands move across the final control sequence, saw Korvath's slender fingers working in perfect coordination beside her, and I saw, gradually, impossibly, the flashing red lights begin to slow, then steady, then finally shift toward a calm, reassuring green that spread slowly across the entire reactor display. The alarms fell silent. The emergency lighting flickered, then returned to its normal, gentle glow, And somewhere in that sudden quiet, I heard Captain Kane release a breath he must have been holding for what felt like an eternity. "Reactor core stability restored," the ship's voice announced, calm as it had always been. "Even now, even after everything, all personnel may return to normal duties." Tessa emerged from the engineering section nearly an hour later, exhausted, her uniform stained with sweat and grease, but smiling, truly smiling, in a way I had not seen from her in longer than I could remember. Korvath emerged alongside her, their skin cycling through patterns that I had come to understand, after months of careful observation, represented something very close to relief and quiet triumph. "It is done," Tessa said simply, when I rushed forward to meet her. "The core is stable, fully stable, for the first time in 18 years. We can finally resume course toward Illyra Prime." I do not think words exist, in any language, human or otherwise, capable of fully capturing what that moment felt like, standing in that corridor, surrounded by exhausted engineers and anxious council members, hearing those simple words after nearly 2 decades of uncertainty, rationing, grief, and stubborn, exhausting hope. I remember Captain Kane closing his eyes for a long moment, his lips moving silently, though whether in prayer or simple relief I never asked. I remember Bram Halloway, standing beside me, quietly beginning to cry, tears he made no effort to hide or apologize for. The journey that followed, once our restored engines finally carried Solace back onto a true course toward Illyra Prime, took nearly 3 more years to complete, even with the additional assistance the Ylvain continued to offer throughout our final approach. 3 years felt, after everything we had already endured, almost gentle by comparison, a quiet, hopeful stretch of time spent finally preparing for the actual arrival so many of us had privately stopped believing we would ever truly experience. I was 47 years old when Illyra Prime finally appeared on our main viewing screen, no longer a distant collection of numbers and probe images, but a real, living world, green oceans catching unfamiliar sunlight, twin moons hanging pale and beautiful against a sky none of us had ever seen with our own eyes. I stood in the observation deck alongside nearly every remaining member of the original crew who had survived the entire journey, watching that impossible, long-awaited sight together in a silence too full of meaning for any words to properly hold. Ren stood beside me, her infant daughter cradled carefully in her arms, and I watched my niece's face as she stared out at the world her own child would grow up calling home, a world Ren herself had spent her entire childhood believing might exist only as legend and hopeful story. "It is real," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Aunt Marin, it is actually real." "Yes," I told her, unable to keep my own voice entirely steady. "It was always real. We simply had to survive long enough to prove it." The landing itself, when it finally came, felt almost anticlimactic after so many years of anticipation, though I do not think anyone aboard Solace would have described it that way in the moment. I remember stepping outside for the very first time in 18 years, feeling actual wind against my skin, actual sunlight warming my face in a way our carefully maintained growing lamps had never quite managed to replicate. I remember watching children born aboard the ship, children who had known nothing but metal corridors and recycled air their entire lives, running across an open field for the very first time, their laughter carrying across a landscape none of them had ever imagined they would actually reach. Observer Thessaly and several of their Ylvain colleagues remained with us through those first difficult months of establishing our new colony, continuing the careful, respectful study that had begun during those long conversations back aboard the drifting ship. I spent many evenings during that first year sitting with Observer Thessaly on the shores of Illyra Prime's largest ocean, watching unfamiliar sunsets paint the sky in colors I had never expected to witness beyond old photographs and half-remembered stories. "I still do not believe our previous models adequately captured what your people demonstrated," Observer Thessaly admitted during one such evening, their skin cycling slowly through patterns I had, after so many months of careful observation, finally learned to interpret as something close to genuine wonder. "We expected to find, at best, a population that had managed to preserve basic biological survival through fortunate circumstance. We found instead a population that had actively chosen, again and again, across nearly 2 decades of severe hardship, to preserve not merely their bodies, but everything that gave those bodies genuine meaning and purpose. I considered their words carefully before responding, watching the strange, beautiful sunset continue its slow descent toward an unfamiliar horizon. I think that may be the real answer to the question that started everything, I finally said. How long could a colony ship survive in deep space? The true answer was never really about resources, or engines, or careful calculations of remaining oxygen and food. The true answer was always about how long people are willing to keep choosing each other, even when every reasonable measure suggests they should stop. Observer Thessaly remained quiet for a long moment, watching the same sunset alongside me. "And how long is that?" they finally asked. "In your own experience." I thought of that first terrible night, of Petra Lindgren's grief, outside the sealed doors of Section 12. I thought of Corin Ashby's careful agricultural discoveries, of Odalys Frayne's trembling hands as she signed off on impossible rationing decisions. I thought of Bram Halloway's quiet insistence that survival without meaning was no true survival at all, of Tessa Bellamy's steady hands stabilizing a failing reactor core in what might have been our final moments, of Wren's infant daughter, born free beneath an open sky her own mother had once believed existed only in legend. "As long as it takes," I finally said, watching the last light of that impossible, beautiful sunset fade slowly into the gathering dusk of our new, hard-won home. That is the only honest answer I have ever found. As long as it takes, and not one moment less, because giving up was never truly an option any of us were willing to consider. Solace itself remained in orbit above Illyra Prime for many years afterward, gradually converted from a living vessel into a monument, a careful, permanent reminder of everything the ship and its people had endured and ultimately overcome. I visited it myself, many years later, an old woman by then, standing once more in the observation deck where I had first felt the smallest flicker of hope on that long-ago night when everything about our future remained uncertain. I thought, standing there, surrounded by the quiet, empty corridors that had once held 4,000 frightened, determined lives, about the question that had shaped nearly every year of my own existence. How long could a colony ship survive in deep space? I understood, finally, standing in that silent, sacred place, that the true answer had never been a number at all. The true answer was simply this: however long it takes, a people determined to remain a people, rather than merely a collection of separate, frightened individuals, will always find a way to keep surviving and keep becoming until the darkness they once feared finally gives way to an unfamiliar, impossible, beautiful dawn.